What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Starting another series. This one's going to be on rebuilding a Land Rover LT230T transfer case. This is a center locking diff version out of a 2004 that we're going to be going through, refreshing and installing into a 2003, which did not come with the factory center diff lock. Some of the older ones, 99 to mid 02s, you still had the center diff lock. It just wasn't a mechanism to shift it, but the mid 02s and 03s didn't have that at all. So this is for my buddy Scott. We're going to be building this, installing his 2003. It's going to probably be a 2 or 3 part series, probably 3-part series of rebuilding it. We'll do the tear down, we'll do the inspection, and then we'll do the rebuild. We're going to be replacing most of the internal parts. Don't know about the gear sets, all that stuff yet. We'll have to see how that all looks when we get it apart, but we are going to be installing the Ashcroft HD cross pin. We're going to be installing a new high range gear bushing, new Sun and planetary gears for the center differential. We have all the proper shims and everything, the rebuild kits with the crush washers and everything. All these parts came from Ashcroft Transmissions over in the UK. Great company. New drive flanges, and then all new Timken bearings throughout. So it'll be a brand new fresh transfer case. One thing I do want to show you guys, I will be referencing the factory Land Rover LT230 transfer case overhaul manual, and I'll also be referencing Trailer Fitters Toolbox YouTube channel, formerly known as the Land Rover Toolbox. He's got a great build series, tear down rebuild of the LT230T with a lot of really good information, stuff that's not quite in the service manual. So shout out to him, great YouTube channel, lots of good information on there. So guys, make sure you give him a like, a follow, and a subscribe. So stick around and we'll get this thing tore down and go from there. Thanks for watching, guys. All right, so the first step on this is we need to remove the parking brake drum. This has like a number 4 Phillips screw in here. We'll move this and I'll take the parking brake drum off. And the reason I say it's a number 4 is you take a number 3 screwdriver. It's a little big for it, but it works. Those little hand drive impacts are great for getting these off. When you put this back on, this does not need to be super tight. Get that out of there, and we'll just set this aside for now. All right, so next up we got 4 bolts under here that hold the parking brake in place. So we'll get those broke loose and we'll get the parking brake assembly off. So this is a salvage yard transfer case. So the parking brake cable was cut. If you're dealing with parking brake cable, that's as simple as just pulling it off this little clip right here. So next step is going to be removing the sump cover. So just make a note where these 2 bolts are. They need to go back into these holes right here. And then you got these 10mm bolts. We'll get them knocked off there real quick. So these 2 here are 17mm. So this transfer case is sealed with RTV silicone. There's no gaskets in it. Some of the older ones will have gaskets. So getting this cover off is not super simple. It's on there pretty good. It's been on there since 2004. It's probably the first time it's ever been off. And it is aluminum, so you gotta be careful. You don't want to pry against it real hard or anything like that. But I'm gonna take a very small screwdriver and just start kind of fishing my way in there and try to get that silicone to break loose. So I've got this very small, very thin little screwdriver. Then I'm gonna try to catch this corner right here and start working my way in there. I'm going to try not to pry. I don't want to bend or misshape the cover. Once it starts to go, you should be able to work your way around. Looks like a little bit of water was in there. So here's our first look at the inside of the transfer case. This is an all gear driven transfer case. They're actually very, very strong, and it's a really good transfer box. Land Rover knew what they were doing when they built this thing. So in case you're wondering, this is a 1.21 to 1 gear ratio. This is the common gear ratio for the Discovery 2s. If it was a 1.4 or whatever to 1, that's the common gear ratio for the Defenders. Some guys will actually do the 1.4 to 1 in the Discos for a little bit of gear reduction when they run a little bit bigger tire. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to unstake this nut and remove this nut off the intermediate shaft, And then this is a anti-rotation plate for the intermediate shaft. We're going to get that off. This nut will not be reused. That'll get thrown away, but we'll get this thing out of here, get the intermediate shaft out. And take a punch, drive a punch in there to undo the staking. Give it a little pry up. That'll get that staking from the factory out of there. So this intermediate nut is a 30 millimeter. Go ahead and bust that loose. And then that is a 10 millimeter. And that's the, you can see how this is got a flat spot in it that holds the intermediate shaft from turning. All right, so the next step is going to be to drive the intermediate shaft out of the transfer case. It comes out, there's an O-ring on the back side here, so we'll just use a dead blow hammer and tap that out of the transfer case. There's your intermediate shaft. We'll go over the inspection of this stuff in fine detail later. I'm just going to have a look at it, see how worn it is. You can definitely see it's got a little bit of wear on there. I can feel a little bit of a ridge, but we'll get measurements on this later to make sure it's in spec. If not, we'll have to get a replacement. All right, so the next step is to get the intermediate gears out. I have found that if you take a piece of wire and kind of get it around the gear set, and it takes a little bit of finagling to get this under there. But if you can get this wire up and around the gear set, then you'll be able to lift the gear up and out. And I started with wire that already had a pretty good twist in it. You can see how it just kind of fished its way up and around. So I'll go ahead and grab a pair of needle nose and grab a hold of that wire. There we go. Now we can go ahead and lift the intermediate shaft and gears up and out. Takes a little bit of doing, but just lift it straight up and out, and the bearings will fall out, and you got the crush sleeve on the inside of the gears there that'll stay inside the gears for right now. Here's our kind of first look at the intermediate bearings. Just looking for any sort of signs of weird uneven wear. Seem to be in pretty good shape. So obviously we'll be getting new ones of these, but it's always good to inspect the bearings as you're taking apart to look for potential problems. So now service manual wants you to make a reference mark in the position of this cover. Get this little nub right here on the case. So I'm going to take just a flat screwdriver and I'm going to go right here on the case and put a little notch. That way I know that notch lines up with that nub. And you gotta be real hard, just a little reference mark. So go ahead and pull this PTO cover off. These are 13 millimeter bolts. Alright, so this PTO cover is actually two pieces, and this race right here for this bearing is one of the races that you shim to set preload. So now this is really important that this piece all stays together. We'll have to break this apart later, but we're going to set this aside for right now. And we'll go ahead and we will remove the input gears. Have a quick look at them. Quick look at the bearings. Again, this isn't necessarily a full inspection. We're just looking to see if anything stands out right away. All that stuff looks to be fairly good for right now. Ah, the lovely aroma of EP90 gear oil. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the high-low selector case. Now these 4 bolts were already missing, so we'll just have to get those out of the donor transfer case out of the truck. Give that a little tap. Out she comes. Looks pretty good. Alright, next thing we do is we'll remove these 4 sensors. So these are 19 millimeter. One thing you do want to do is make note of where these go. So I'll use this video as my reference. Connectors are broken. Alright, so this one I couldn't quite get the open end on there, so I just grabbed a line wrench. Get this one broke loose. Alright, next thing we do is we're going to remove the front output housing. So this is a series of 10mm bolts. There's your center diff. Here's front output housing. This is the part that has the center diff lock in it. That dog clutch engaged with the teeth in that. So if you have a non-center locking diff transfer case, you won't have those parts down in there. All right, next thing to do is we're going to remove this set screw right here. This has the spring and a detent ball for your high-low selector shaft. So this is going to be under a little bit of spring tension, so you got to be careful when taking this out that it doesn't get away from you, because you don't want to lose that ball bearing and you don't want to lose that spring. And that's going to be 6mm. Just grab a little magnet, pull the spring out of there, and I'll get the detent ball out of there. Alright, so the next step is the differential and the high-low selector shaft is all going to come out as one assembly. And it's pretty heavy, so you got to kind of hang on to it. Yep. So here's the center differential, your high and low range gears. And this is your high-low range selector. So this is your high range gear, this is your low range gear. So all that looks to be in pretty good shape. We'll get inspecting in the gears and stuff when we get everything cleaned up. And then next step is we're going to remove the rear output housing. We got these bolts that go around and get them pulled out. Get this case stripped out. We're getting pretty close. Front output or rear output housing. Feels good. So there's the LT230 stripped down to the case. Now we just got to go ahead and break down all the components. Get started on that as soon as I'm done cooking dinner, which I got to go do now. Alright, so here is the transfer case kind of laid out on the bench. We've still got stuff we got to drive races out of these. We got to pull this bearing off of the intermediate shaft, PTO housing, front output housing. There's a lot to disassemble on this still. Shift fork, center diff, low range, high range, rear output housing, rear output shaft, PTO cover, and the case. So lots to clean, lots to inspect, lots to take apart still, but there it is, kind of broke down. All right, we'll go ahead and we're going to drive the races out of this. So I got it set up on 2 blocks of wood here. That gives me access to the inside of the races. So you can see the race in there. Alright, now to get the bearings off the intermediate shaft, this is the only way that I have to do it in my shop, is using this three jaw puller. Shit going everywhere. so now we're going to disassemble the front output housing. First thing I'm going to do is take this cover off here, and then we'll have to remove the transfer case diff lock, which is missing 2 bolts here. Next thing we do is we got to pull this another set screw out with a detent ball. So get that out of there. We got the retaining clips out of there. Now we're going to get the selector shaft out of here. Spring out of there. Then we'll put the spring, the shaft, and the containers in the Ziploc. Then we'll draw the shift fork out. So here's kind of a homemade tool that I've made just out of some garage door opener arms that will hold the drive flange in place. Okay. Get this felt washer off of here. That'll be garbage. Alright, now we're going to drive the shaft out of the bearing using a rubber mallet. I'm going to try it right here on this bench, but this bench got quite a bit of rebound, so I may end up putting it on the anvil. Came out pretty easy. So that's your diff lock shaft. If you didn't have the diff lock, this wouldn't have these teeth on it. It would just be a smooth shaft. Go ahead and we'll pull this seal out. Seal out of there. Alright, now we're going to drive the bearing out. And you can see you got a little spot right there and a little spot right there that's notched out where you can drive the bearing out of the housing. Alright, so there's the bearing driven out of the front output housing. Alright, so there's front output housing stripped out, got all of our parts separated for cleaning and inspection later. But there's that. So this is just ready to get cleaned. The only thing I didn't take out of here is the bearing race in here, because there's a set of shims behind that. We're going to leave that in there for setup later, so we'll get to that step during reassembly. But that's the only thing I didn't strip out, was the bearing race that the center diff rides on. Alright, so now we have the center diff that we need to disassemble. So you got your high range gear that rides on a bushing, your low range gear, the actual differential itself. This takes a special socket to remove this nut right here. I don't have the special tool, so I took a axle nut socket and ground it to fit. So that fits on here just like that. That's how I'm able to remove this nut, which is staked, so we'll have to unstake it and get this off. And you got to pull this bearing, and then you got to pull this bearing. This is a pain in the butt to get this one off because of the bolts for the differential. Getting the 3-jaw pullers on there is kind of tough, but it's doable with just regular basic tools. So we'll get that off, and then we'll take all the bolts out of the center differential. That comes apart with, I have our cross pins, our sun gear, and our planetary gears in there. So that's what we're doing next. Okay. Alright, so now we got this bearing pulled off. We'll go ahead and pull the diff apart. 17mm bolts. Alright, so this is the inside of the center differential. You have the cross pin. It's a 2-piece cross pin that sits in there. This is one of the weakest points of this entire transfer case. That's why we'll be installing that Ashcroft HD cross pin that makes this a 1-piece. So we'll go ahead and get these out here. These are usually in here fairly tight, so they kind of gonna get popped out. So we'll go ahead and get this swapped out. A little bit of backlash in those gears. So these are the thrust washers. It's basically the wear point for the center diff, and these are just about gone. You see that hole is oblong like that. But that's the wear point for these, and that is worn almost completely through. So those are shot. Now normally you'd want to keep these in order, but since we got all new replacements for these aren't that important to keep them in order. But just for fun, I'll go ahead and set those off to the side in order. Leave them in their original position. Yeah, same thing. That thrust washer is completely worn. And here's your sun gear. So here's the one side. Oh, look at the gunk in there. Yuck. So there's our first half of our center diff. Here's your center ring. Here's your other sun bearing, or I'm sorry, sun gear. The wear on them is not bad. Not too bad at all. Alright, the next thing is getting this bearing off, which is a complete pain in the ass because of how this gear is recessed. Getting a puller under there, these puller teeth will not fit under there. So I have a little trick to get this off. I'll show you guys here in a minute. That's all we can do for today. So we will see you guys in the next day or two. Alright guys, so I got the diff set up on the press. I'm not gonna be able to video it while I do it because it's gonna require 2 hands, so I don't want it all come apart, but that's how I got it set up on the press, so I can press the diff center section out of all the gear sets and off the bearing. Alright, so saw where I went and drove the bearing off the shaft. So there's the diff bearing, here's the high range bushing. And as you take the stuff off of this shaft, you want to keep it in order. So basically as I pull it off, I'm going to set it straight down on the bench, and that'll be reassembled in the same order that it comes off. So here's the high range gear, and here's your high range engagement teeth. right? Look at the wear on the teeth. Nothing stands out there. Here is the, you can tell where the high range, this truck's basically lived in high range its entire life because of all the wears on one side. So this is where the low range would ride. This is where the high range would ride. Here's the Selector. And here's your low range. So what we're doing here is we're feeling for any sort of play up and down. Now there is some tolerance measurements that we'll get into here in a little bit. For right now, this is just a preliminary inspection. And what I'm doing is I'm feeling for any sort of play on the shaft, because this gear rides directly on the shaft. It doesn't have any sort of bushing or bearing. And there's absolutely no play in that whatsoever. So that actually feels really good. That all appears to be in actually really good condition. Alright, so next thing we do is we're going to pull this drive flange off the rear output housing, and then we'll get the rear output shaft out of the rear output housing. So again, we'll use our little custom homemade tool here. Washer out of there. Output shaft appears to be in good condition. And we'll get the seal pulled out of this and get the bearing knocked out. Just like on the other one, we got a snap ring in here we got to get out. Same thing like on the other housing, you have these little recesses right here. You're going to get rid of the punch so you can drive the bearing out. Bearings out. Alright, so there's the LT230, broke down all of its major components. Like I said earlier, here's your intermediate gears and bearings, here's your input gears and bearings, your front output housing, center differential, internal parts, high range and low range gear set broke down with your differential pieces. Here's your rear output housing all broke down, PTO cover and the bearing support, and then the case. So now that is an LT230, broke down all its components. So that'll be the end of this video. Thanks for watching, guys. I'm going to be doing the full inspection of all this parts, measuring all the tolerances, getting everything all set up, and then that'll be the next video. And then the third video will be reassembling and getting all this stuff set up. There's a lot to do when it comes to measuring bearing preloads and tolerances and backlashes and all that stuff. Alright guys, well thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you in the next video.